Okay, so atheists lie a lot, and I'm afraid they just do. That's not even a rhetorical point. Now, I know you guys get mad because you say, as an individual atheist, you don't lie all that much, whatever. Here's the bottom line. Atheism is a movement ideology. It's rooted in cultural Marxism. It has been at least since the new atheism started 10 years ago. And if you believe certain things, you have been indoctrinated in the cultural Marxist atheist dialectic, or the scientific naturalist dialectic. And what that will generally mean is that you have been made to believe things that aren't scientific, or made to believe that things that are supposedly scientific that aren't. The biggest area where this is true is in the area of something called scientific naturalism. Just so you know, you'll find that the proponents of scientific naturalism are invariably either hardcore atheists or what you might call soft atheist agnostics. Like, let's say, Neil Tyson. He doesn't even like the word atheist, but if you listen to him talk, he talks exactly like an atheist most of the time, with the same kind of air of condescending bigotry toward religion and religious people that most atheists exude. Plus, Tyson himself has even been caught just putting out fabricated history, like in his Cosmos series. So the scientific naturalists will pretend they are the avatars of science, but in fact, they're not even scientists most of the time. Even the ones who are scientists, frequently, they're just ideologues. Scientific naturalism works great if you're an engineer, and probably if you're a physicist, and maybe not even when you're a physicist, especially if you're a theoretical physicist, but whatever. Scientific naturalism is just an assumption. There's nothing scientific about scientific naturalism. It's a philosophy of science. That's all it is, a philosophy of science, a guiding set of assumptions that scientists can use. In some areas, it might be useful, especially anything involving physics, and I imagine chemistry. It's as a guiding set of assumptions, it might take you useful places. Doesn't necessarily, though, because there's other ways of looking at it that don't involve naturalism that can also be productive, but whatever. On the other hand, there's all sorts of other science people accept every day that can't be said to come from physical processes, except in the most arm-waving way. For example, do you believe there's any truth at all to public opinion polls? Now don't waver on me and be like, well, they're only so good as the questions and the samples and all that. But broadly speaking, I assume nobody's going to argue that a public opinion poll just has no bearing on reality, right? It's usually a pretty good barometer or indicator, especially if it's done by real responsible pollsters, right? There's a whole science to it. Guess what? They're not measuring anything physical there. They're measuring public opinion. So show me where public opinion can be shown to have an empirical physical basis. You can't do it, can you? Where does public opinion, 30% of people like Pepsi more than Coke, for example. Let's say that's a real number. Where's the physical reality to that? There isn't one. The scientific naturalist will attempt to reduce it all down and say, well, it's all ultimately the result of emergent effects of the electrochemistry of all the collective brains of those people in that moment of time. But you know what? There's nothing scientific about an assertion like that at all. It's just a belief. And it's actually incoherent in a lot of ways because there's a lot of science that points against it. All of this gets to the subject of science in general. They'll tell you, even some old school religious people and others will say, you can't prove God with science. Well, what do you mean by that? Because proof is a subjective term to some extent. So is the word evidence. There is, it turns out, ample evidence in science, in multiple fields of science, that there is something we would call a soul, or at least a mind that transcends the physical. Maybe you'd call it a spirit, whatever. I like the word soul. There is ample evidence that your mind, your thoughts, your ideas are not limited to the electrochemistry of your central nervous system and brain, or indeed not even limited to physical reality at all. There's ample evidence of that. The only reason you would deny it is if you are a scientific naturalist and therefore a dogmatic materialist who insists, counter to the evidence, that everything must be a result of physical processes. But that's just a dogmatic assertion. There's no science to it, and there's no proof for it. In fact, it's the opposite. We all believe in things that are not material. that are clearly not the result of physical processes. Math is not the result of physical processes. Logic is not the result of physical processes. The laws themselves, the laws of physics themselves, can't even be said to be products of the laws of physics. So they made themselves what? The laws of physics, you can't point to them. You just know that they operate and that the physical universe obeys them, just like the physical universe for some reason obeys math, even though we got no reason to explain how to explain that. So here's my bottom line. There's all sorts of things that are not material and that are clearly not part of, that do not come from material processes, or that you certainly, nobody could ever show that they do. And there's ample reason to believe that includes your mind, that you have a soul. Sorry, there's evidence for it. There's evidence for it in multiple fields, including in biology and medicine. Okay, neurobiology, in fact, there's a ton of evidence for it in neurobiology. But we're not going to go into neurobiology today. What we're going to talk about is something much more accessible, near-death experiences. I'm going to flash a few books for you. I'm going to share some screens with you on the subject of near-death experience. Now, before any atheist weasel out there tries to say that this evidence is all I have or all we have, or that we're staking everything on this, never let an atheist get away with saying that to you. No, we have evidence in multiple fields. This is one of the many fields in which we have ample evidence. So you don't even get to run away if you don't like this evidence. We got other evidence in other fields too. The subject of near-death experience is useful because near-death experience research proves, certainly to the satisfaction of countless scientists as well as yours truly, that there is a spiritual reality beyond the laws of physics, beyond the physical reality that we know. In other words, there's such a thing as a soul, and things like out-of-body experiences and spirit encounters really can happen. And no, we don't need, we do have evidence of that, and you can't say we don't. This book here, God in the Afterlife, The Groundbreaking New Evidence for God and Near-Death Experience, is a very accessible, popular book written with, I suspect, a ghostwriter named Paul Perry. I suspect. I bet Dr. Long's not that good, not the main author, really. But whatever, using a ghost is okay. In fact, someone using a ghostwriter for a book on near-death experience seems pretty cool. But anyway, this is a popular distillation and compilation of what is in reality copious peer-reviewed medical research. Let me repeat that, copious peer-reviewed medical research, and you can find that here on the homepage that Dr. Long's been running for many years called NDERF.org. NDERF stands for Near-Death Experience Research Foundation. This is the longest peer-reviewed medical tracking survey of verified near-death experiences out there, and it overwhelmingly affirms that there is something after we die. And it affirms quite a few more things than that. And now here's the big reality on that. He's not the only guy. He's just, to the best of my knowledge, done the only and the largest and most comprehensive and most respected peer-reviewed single, medical tracking survey of this many patients, over 4,000 verified dead, clinically dead, or brain dead. And the data is all there. Another thing that's worth watching if you want to dig into this is an interview with Dr. Long by a guy named Skeptico. Skeptico, if you search for the name Skeptico, you're going to find lots of interesting things. The video I recommend first is this one, Dr. Jeffrey Long, God in the Afterlife, Science and Spirituality Collide. Because here you have a pretty respected interviewer doing a very extensive and exhaustive interview with an actual medical researcher. And you could sort of say he's a pioneer in the field, but not really. There were many who came before him. But here you have it straight out of the horse's mouth. And it's a great interview that should answer any questions you have as to the rigorousness of the science or the legitimacy of Dr. Long's work. You'll also discover in there that ideological atheists go out of their way to avoid even discussing this research, even though it's fully peer-reviewed and the sources are all completely credible. You can look for other things on the topic. For example, here's a book, Proof of Heaven, A Neurosurgeon's Journey into the Afterlife. This Dr. Evan Alexander was a neurosurgeon who had an extraordinary near-death experience. He had been an atheist. By the way, a lot of atheists have near-death experiences. They are not that uncommon in the literature. Very few atheists who have near-death experiences, almost none of them are atheists when they come back from it, which should tell you something pretty interesting too, because really almost none of them. So anyway, he was one of those atheists and a neurosurgeon at that. He had been convinced that there couldn't be that none of this could be true. He documented his own experience, and then after documenting his own experience, then went out to start researching what else was out there in the literature, and found that his particular experience was very close. And it's very interesting because according to him and those who know him, when he first came out, he reported having a near-death experience. And what his colleagues and friends said is write everything down and don't go look at any research on this. Write it all down fresh while it's all still in your mind and it won't be contaminated. So he wrote up his experience and spent some time doing that. Again, never looked at any near-death experience research, never had before. After he wrote it up, then for himself and was satisfied he'd remembered everything right, then he went and started looking in the literature and found a stunning amount of it matched his own experiences. So here's the thing. There's other things you can look at on this topic. I actually suggest going into YouTube and just typing Skeptico. Just remember, Skeptico has no C's. It's all K's. Skeptico, near-death experience. Now, this guy's a bit of an anti-Catholic. It comes off of him sometimes, but it doesn't come up too often, and that's the only warning I have for you about him. Otherwise, Skeptico, Alex Tsaris, does extraordinary work. Now, he's not that popular here on YouTube, but that's not where his base is. He's a very popular and well-known podcaster, and he occasionally puts some of his better podcasts online as a sort of a promotional vehicle. He's actually very, very popular. Got a pretty big audience and is pretty well respected. You look through what he's put on YouTube, some of these interviews are amazing. All of these people are credible. Most of them are scientists. And what you'll also find is every time he gets an atheist scientist on to interview, it's always hilarious. One of the things that Skeptico, his real name's Alex Tsaris, but one of the things that he has documented and others have too is that if you've ever read a popular article or even a popular book on near-death experience written by somebody who's a supposed skeptic writing it off, you should assume that skeptic is a liar. You really can assume that that skeptic is a liar. As Alex Tsaris and others have documented multiple times, including a few times on interviews here, the one with Dr. Gary Marcus and the one with, what was her name? There was this one woman he interviewed. I listened to it. It was just hilarious listening to her. But you see, well, he had one with a Dr. Stephen Novella that's probably worth looking at. There was Sam Parnia. I'm trying to remember. He had a particularly funny one with a woman, well, who was a psychologist. These are all PhD supposed scientists. And they're all hilarious because they just cannot answer. Here's the thing he's documented. None of the so-called skeptics have even bothered to do the due diligence of interviewing a single near-death experience patient. That's right, I'm going to repeat that for you. None of the popular skeptics who poo-poo the near-death experience research have interviewed a single near-death experience patient and are known to run from any who approach them to try to tell them what's wrong with their research, because most intelligent near-death experience patients can poke holes in their research immediately because they're not being honest. They haven't done the due diligence of interviewing the patients, and they haven't, in many cases, even done the due diligence of looking at the peer-reviewed research first before doing their supposed debunking and their supposed explanations. So what you're going to hear from these ideological atheists, these professional skeptics, is a party line that they can reduce it all to material effects. Basically, the electrochemical effects of a dying brain, wishes, dreams, wish fulfillment, etc. And they can't do it. They're lying. The overwhelming data goes against the hypothesis that it could be a dream, against the hypothesis that it could be a short circuit fuse, weird electrical chemical effect of your brain. The data is overwhelmingly against that hypothesis, and it's an extraordinary claim, and they can't prove it. In reality, these reports, these verified medical reports, cannot be so reduced. They can't. And if they tell you they can, challenge them to back that up. Skeptical's done it, and others have too. I had a similar experience. I had an atheist. I started talking about the near-death experience research, and he immediately began lying to me about what the research said and its basis, and even lying and saying that the data wasn't peer-reviewed and all that stuff. Literally, he was lying to me about this research before I had begun talking to him about it. So you've got to remember that atheism is very ideological. There's other things you can look at. I suggest looking at pretty much everything Skeptical has put out. There's other books you can get at. This book by Sam Parnia and Josh Young called Erasing Death, The Science That Is Rewriting the Boundaries Between Life and Death is very highly recommended by professionals who've done work in this field. The Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, 30 Years of Investigation by Janice Manus Holden, Bruce Grayson, Debbie James. The bottom line is atheists have no real answer to that. Here's another one, by the way. This book is less scientific than some of the others. It's mostly interviews by a doctor from the ICU, but these are still medical reports. So here's the bottom line. When you look at any of these things, this is all science. This is all being put out by scientists. Much of it is peer-reviewed. Quite a bit of it is peer-reviewed. So here's the bottom line. If anybody says you can't use science, well, yeah, you can. Because you can't get anybody to really look at this data, not poo-poo it and flip it away, but be a man and really look hard at it. Can you come away from this saying that it is not science? Okay. You can question anything you want. In fact, you can be you can be a little skeptic and poke holes in anything you want, anytime you want. If you're going to be a serious intellectual, I want you to be able to look at me and say, this evidence, all of this evidence that we've just put in here is not science. You're lying. It's science. Number two, is it not evidence? If you say it's not evidence, you're lying. It is evidence. Now, maybe you choose to dismiss the evidence, but I'll tell you right now, you have no scientific basis on which to dismiss the evidence. You will only have your own personal biases and prejudices. You will have only your own arbitrary reasons to dismiss the evidence. But no matter what, even if you do somehow dismiss all of this, there's two things you can't do. You can't say it's not science. You cannot. If you say it's not science, you're a liar. And number two, you can't say that it's not evidence. If you say that it's not evidence, you're a liar. Perfectly rational, perfectly scientific minds, including a great many scientists, have looked at this and says, yes, there's proof there's an afterlife. And by the way, it's proof there's a God too. Now, what does the word proof mean? I guess you'll have to decide. It's certainly evidence. And for the overwhelming majority of near-death experience patients, including the ones who were atheists beforehand, they all considered it proof for God. I'll even point one last thing out, which is that the near-death experience research data does actually present problems theologically. It presents problems theologically for some Christians. It presents problems theologically for some in other religions. It actually militates against certain very simplistic assumptions of salvations among Christians, for example. Without getting into it, what I would say is this. I know some Christians actually don't like this data because they think it's all a tool of the devil to lie to us. I'm not even going to argue about that. That's beyond the science. What's clear here is that it's overwhelming evidence that there is life after death. It simply is. And oh yeah, by the way, that there's a higher power running everything. It's overwhelming evidence for that too. Now, if you choose to militate against the evidence, that's fine. You can say, I don't find it personally convincing for X, Y, and Z. But don't you dare lie and say it's not scientific, and don't you dare lie and say it's not evidence, for it is both scientific and it is evidence. And by the way, all this near-death experience evidence matches evidence in other fields of science. In another video, we'll probably do this, but there's, in the field of neurobiology in general, there's ample evidence that the mind exists outside the body, outside the physical universe. There are minds, that we have a soul. We have evidence for that in other areas, including within neurobiology. So the fact of the matter is, we do have scientific evidence. The problem with scientific evidence is it can always be overturned, right? Which is why I personally don't find scientific evidence the most convincing. I think the classical evidence for God, which we'll also talk about in future videos, I think the classical evidence for God is actually stronger than this. But you know what? The near-death experience research is enough, I think, to settle one debate point. Is there any science? Is there any rationality? Is there any evidence? It turns out in the case of God in the afterlife, yeah, we got science. We got medical science on our side. Peer-reviewed, clinical, medical science is on our side. Now, there's two shifty things you'll hear atheists say, and then I'm going to be done here. One shifty thing atheists will say is that they'll actually say that it's not evidence at all until, actually they'll say it's not evidence, period. That's the main lie they'll give. The second most common lie they'll say is it's not really proof because it's not after death, it's just near death. Call an atheist a liar when he says that too. In every one of these cases, they're physically verified to clinically to have been dead or brain dead. Clinically verified, brain shut down, brain shut off. All of medical science agreed that's what was going on. These were all medically verified. So they're lying. Or at best, they've made an extraordinary claim and they need to prove it. Because these reports are too consistent across too many reports over too many years from too many disinterested medical professionals. So really, make them prove that extraordinary claim. And otherwise, maybe in the next one we'll get into the neurobiology, or maybe in the next time we'll get into more of the classical evidence for God. In the meantime, though, give us a like, give us a subscribe, and God bless everybody.